We are in a staccanovist rhythm, so we have to start just now because we have a short session. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to CFA to organize this event on this subject, which is sometimes a bit complicated, but in fact, not so much when you enter in it. We will have 5 speakers. 2 would be online. Katia Karoukis from OECD, Hélène Perrier from European Union will be online. And on my right, Lena Gubler, which is coming from Switzerland, and which has been doing a report on harmful subsidies to biodiversity in Switzerland. Aldo Ravazzi on my left, which has been doing about the same thing or coordinating about the same thing in Italy. And myself, I have been doing the same thing in France some years ago already. So if we are online with Katia, we will take time for the question and answer after, but we could start with Katia because OECD has worked a lot on this subject, and she could begin the talk if she's in line. If she is not in line, we will wait that she would be in line, and we will let the floor to Lena.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
She is in line.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Okay, Katia, we can hear you, but we cannot see you, so you can begin to speak if you want. And
okay. Just to check, can
we
you
are
see
going
my
to try
slides?
to manage the image.
Great. Can you see my slides?
Katia, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you see my slides?
No, we can't see your slides, but we're having trouble here on our end, I think, unless you have 2 screens in your
Katia?
No, I only have 1 screen, and Kumar
okay.
has my slides as well, so feel free to load them up on your computer. From
Okay, no, looking good now. Looking good now. Okay,
wonderful.
Problem on our end, so we're all set. Yeah.
Yes, that's good, Katia. You can go on, I think.
Merci, merci. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to be going through this rather quickly because there's not a lot of time, but it's on reforming harmful subsidies and how to get information on that, the type of information that is available, etc. So just some very quick context as this is the first presentation. There is a strong need to identify, assess, and monitor biodiversity and environmentally harmful subsidies. And just to give you ballpark estimates on the finance that we're talking about, we did a report in 2020 called A Comprehensive Overview of Global Biodiversity Finance, and estimated that finance for biodiversity protection was estimated at between $78 to $91 billion a year. Based on a number of OECD data that I'll go through and talk about, because we do document and a lot of countries are providing information to us, and I'll go through that. The total estimate on potentially environmentally harmful government support, it was estimated at approximately 500 billion a year. This was also in our report, our 2020 report on a comprehensive overview of global biodiversity finance. And following the data and the latest trends, we've released a report this year called Biodiversity, Natural Capital, and the Economy. And these environmentally harmful and market distorting support is now at greater than $800 billion a year, also based on additional countries that are reporting. And just the context, if we look at the Convention on Biological Diversity in the 2011-2020, we had the CBDI Biodiversity Target 3, which was on both positive and harmful incentives, so scale up positive incentives and reform harmful incentives. And today we're in the midst of negotiations for proposed Target 18, which is also on incentives. Now, the abstract for this session was on why it's important to reform and how to go about doing so, and what kind of data is available out there. So first, I just like to highlight that there are different steps to reforming environmentally harmful subsidies. These are outlined here, admitting that certain subsidies and government support might actually be causing problems, and then having good information on the size and the nature of those subsidies and the support, understanding the effects on environment, if they were reformed, what types of impacts they would have, and then taking lessons from other countries that have undertaken reform to learn from them and try and move ahead domestically as well. In this regard, I'm going to go through 3 sets of data that we track at the OECD. Just to highlight, the first is on fossil fuel support, so government support to fossil fuels. We also track data on government support to agriculture and also government support to fisheries. So I'm going to go through these again fairly quickly. I have all the references here if you'd like further information. But the latest data, which is preliminary still at this time for this year, preliminary combined estimates of government support for fossil fuels, which is measured by both IEA and OECD combined. This is for 52 G20 and emerging economies, showed a decline in fossil fuel subsidies from nearly 500 billion in 2019 to nearly 350 billion in 2020. We do also have a G20 peer review on fossil fuel subsidies, which is chaired by the OECD, which brings together different countries to go through at the domestic level, the steps they're taking on reforming those subsidies. It's an avenue for bringing together the countries to talk about their different experiences in the reforms, to exchange and share lessons and try and move forward in that regard. So this is the data on fossil fuel support. We know fossil fuel support means climate change, and climate change is one of the 3 primary drivers of key drivers of biodiversity loss. We also track trends in government support to agriculture. These are all of this is listed here, and then it's split up to categorize it in terms of what's the potentially most environmentally harmful support, the least harmful, and other types of support. And so obviously not all agricultural support is environmentally harmful, but some of it certainly is potentially environmentally harmful. And here we have trends over time since 1990. And this is for OECD countries and beyond. This is not only, well, this particular data is for OECD, but we also, a number of other countries are also providing data to us on that. We also track government support to fisheries. The latest data, this is every year, and the latest data is provided in OECD Review of Fisheries 2020. And the latest data shows that fisheries support in 39 countries is greater than 9 billion a year. This is the 2016 to 2018 average. And if you take the extract of the OECD countries, it's at 4.6 billion. Again, not all fisheries support is harmful to the environment, but based on various types of OECD work, it identifies the types of subsidies and support that can lead to overfishing and lead to also illegal and unreported IUU fishing, etc. So there's much more information there. I just want to highlight something that I think is very important, is that all of this data is collected in a consistent and comparable way across countries. So there's definite comparability within the data sets. And finally, I'd just like to highlight, we are developing we have ongoing work to develop guidance to identify and assess subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity. We've looked across a number of countries, some of whom are on your panel today. So experiences from Italy, from France. There are several others, unfortunately not very many, but hopefully more over time. The idea is to compare their approaches and scopes and methodologies, and then develop guidance for any other country that wishes to undertake a national level assessment of subsidies harmful to biodiversity, so that they have a one-stop shop in a sense. Quick, easy guidance. What are the key questions you need to ask? What are the different approaches other countries have used, and how you might want to determine and identify your own harmful subsidies domestically, the scope, etc. Of course, Identifying and assessing the subsidies is one step. Then you need to go into the policy reform process, which deals with winners and losers, potential distributional issues, potential competitiveness issues, vested interests. And in that regard, we did some work a few years ago on the political economy of biodiversity reform to identify what are the types of obstacles you encounter in undertaking policy reform, including on harmful incentives and subsidies. What lessons are there from recent reforms, and how to push that forward. So here is a quick summary of some of the 6 lessons, but there's much more information available in detail in the publication. I just want to highlight and finish with one final point. There's been a lot of attention now also in the post-2020 negotiations on the need to reform harmful incentives and support. That's something obviously the OECD Secretariat has been promoting with our data and the policy recommendations we provided over years. What is maybe a bit surprising is that we're seeing less attention paid on the positive incentives. And this is the flip side of the coin. It's one thing to reform your harmful subsidies. Obviously, that's very, very important. But at the same time, in order to internalize your negative externalities and to promote incentives, positive incentives for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, you also need to put in place the positive incentives. And these are things like biodiversity relevant taxes, fees and charges, tradable permits, payments for ecosystem services, biodiversity offsets, etc. These are particular instruments are called economic instruments. We track them at the OECD in our database on policy instruments for the environment. They're key instruments for mainstreaming biodiversity across a range of possible sectors, and they can also generate revenue, such as through biodiversity relevant taxes, which can be earmarked if desired and placed back into conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, or just by themselves, they mobilize finance, such as through payments for ecosystem services, or environmentally motivated subsidies that are relevant to biodiversity. What we see here is that these economic instruments are not being used to their potential. We have data here from 1980 to 2021 now. We're about to release our newest update on tracking economic instruments and finance for biodiversity, the 2021 version. We have more than 120 countries that are providing information to us, and you see here the trends over time in 4 of these instruments. We have some further information on PES and offsets as well, not reflected here. But you see a plateau generally since 2010, which is when Aichi Target 3 was put into place. We have a lot more information. This is just one snapshot. This is on the number of countries with these instruments, but we have the total number of instruments. We have it by country. We have how much revenue has been generated by the biodiversity relevant taxes, which, by the way, has remained stable over the past 10 years, implying that they're not becoming more ambitious. And so just to highlight that, of course, we need to reform harmful subsidies, environmentally harmful subsidies, but we need also in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and beyond that to scale up the use and ambition of these positive economic incentives. Thank you very much. I'm sure I went over time and I apologize, but I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Katja. Please stay with us for the question and answer. And I'm going to give the floor now to Lena Gubler, which is going to talk to us about the work she has been doing in Switzerland on the same subject.
It's on. Can you hear me?
Seven minutes,
okay.
7 minutes if possible.
It was, yeah. I practice it for 10. I try to speak very, very fast. Okay. Thank you for the word. I'm very glad to present you here our study we've published last year about biodiversity damaging subsidies in Switzerland. We are the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow and Landscape. We are a federal institute. but we are not funded by Swiss Confederation completely. So we have a lot of projects which are third-party funded, such as this project. The responsible body for the study was we and another research institute, the Swiss Biodiversity Forum, and 2 NGOs. Okay, the starting point, we've heard it, you all know it, the HE Target 3, which was ratified by Switzerland as well. And this target was overtaken into the Swiss Biodiversity Strategy by the Federal Council by 2012. That till 2020, we should have evaluated and, if possible, avoided harmful subsidies and other incentives. That's why, well, in 2020, our study was published. It was the first broad overview of biodiversity damaging subsidies. We aimed to do this on a national level, but where possible, also on a cantonal and a communal level. These are the 2 other political levels in Switzerland. We also give recommendations for reforming or redirecting the subsidies, and where this makes sense to removing them, always in order to minimize the negative effect on biodiversity. Okay, what types of subsidies we're talking about? We had a very broad definition of subsidies. So first, the on-budget subsidies, for sure, like the direct money transfer. Okay, sorry. But we also looked at the off-budget subsidies. As the name says, they don't appear in any budget, so it's much more complicated to quantify them. It's mostly tax breaks. But we went a step further and looked also at the implicit subsidies. They were mainly external costs, external ecological costs. So you see some different definitions from different institutions. We looked of all of them, the whole range, and in some cases we went even further and looked at financial disincentives harmful to biodiversity, which is not really a subsidy. For example, earmarking of the revenue of transport taxes, they are reinvested in transport infrastructure in Switzerland. So this is would be an example. Okay, how we did it. So we didn't look at the subsidies existing and screening them. We looked at the first place at the state of biodiversity. So we made a couple of workshops with biodiversity experts looking at the stage and the drivers behind the damages. So we had a long list of drivers, and then we looked about the subsidies behind the drivers. So we had to exclude some of the drivers because they were not subsidized. And then we had this whole list of subsidies. We also included the results of a survey, of a national-wide survey we conducted to get on a communal and a cantonal level. We have over 2,000 communities in Switzerland, so we couldn't analyze all of them, but we tried to get some information out of population. We tried to quantify them. It was not always possible, for sure. We described them and we made an evaluation. We made an evaluation of the proportion of harmfulness. Sometimes subsidies are not completely damaging, but some part of them, and of the level of damage caused. Okay, and this is the result in one slide. What you see, just a remark in the beginning, the numbers and also the size of the pies are referring to the numbers of subsidies, not to the amount of money. What you can see easily, can I point actually? Oh no, ooh, well, we analyzed 8 sectors. What you can see easily, it's in transport, agriculture, energy sector, and settlements. These are the sectors with the most damaging subsidies. What you can see else is this nice rose colors. If you look at what this means, it's the negative impact is often low or medium, or sometimes even unclear. This is because the evaluation we made was very conservative. The impact is often indirect or not, you cannot quantify it or and so on. So we made it very conservatively. Okay, but the whole number of 162 damaging subsidies shows the urgent need of action. And if we look at the amount of money in Swiss francs, we have 16 billions of unbudgeted subsidies, which are partially or completely damaging to biodiversity. We have 14 billions of off-budget subsidies. There we could only quantify 50% of the whole subsidy. So this number would be much higher. We have around 5 billion implicit and 5 billion, this is financial disincentive. And if you look at the sums, the amount of money by sectors, and I just want to mention two things. Transport is the sector which is far the most subsidized sector, followed by agriculture. Okay, I go through quickly through the examples. In transport, we have 33 subsidies with a fragmenting or a polluting effect. These are mostly the rebates on charges for motorized transport on the street and in the air. In agriculture, we have the basic payment, which is a big share of the direct payment in Switzerland. This bears two disincentives within this basic payment, which already supports an intensive agriculture, because it's linked to a minimum level of livestock. So you have to raise your livestock to get the payment, and you get a lower rate of payment for biodiversity priority areas. Then in the energy sector, one example from the consumption side, this would be the free allocation of emission allowances up to 90% for the companies that are integrated into the emission trading scheme. The settlement development, there you have the big pie of off-budget subsidies. These are all the possibilities of deduction for your private housing. As an example, the deduction of underutilization. So if you can prove that you don't use a room, you can deduct its cost from your taxes. Okay, but now we talked about the biodiversity damaging effect of these subsidies, but they are also economically inefficient. Why? Because the budgets, they are charged in several ways. First, you have to pay the subsidies that are damaging. Then you have to, at the other side, you have to fund the biodiversity promotion, which is up to 1 billion in Switzerland a year. And then in the medium term, you have the repair cost of damages that lays on the budgets. And you have administrative expenses. If you tackle the damages through restrictions or control measures, which are followed by monitorings, etc., you have raised costs there. And last but not least, you have reputational damages for the recipients, where you can see the damage in the field. Okay, we see three possible political approaches. First, that would be on a legal basis, the process of subsidies, allocation and evaluation, to include a criteria of consideration of biodiversity on the legal act of subsidies, like before they are given, or when they are evaluated. They are evaluated every 6 years in Switzerland, then the subsidies on a national level. You could, second, you could reform individual subsidies. You can make a prioritization of impact or of amount of money, or also by opportunity if some legal bases are revised or something. And third point, which is a bit zoomed out, and that would be to enhance policy coherence. I mean, we know that behind every subsidies there are a big conflict of political goals. So if you could align the sectoral goals with environmental goals, you could already lower the conflicts behind the subsidies. For example, transport goals. Transport planning is based on transport scenarios. They look at the transport we have and we have now, and they make some extrapolations, but they are not aligned with environmental goals. If they would try to or make scenarios to reach the environmental goals, they would propose some political measures to reach these goals, and then they would reform this. They would have to reform the subsidies to get there. Okay, last slide. Since the publication of our study, we had a lot of reaction in Switzerland. The overall interest in the beginning in the media was very high and still is, and also in politics. So we had also various sectors. They were afraid of reduced financial support. So we get a lot of criticism from the small hydro, the wind, the forest sectors, the roads and the agriculture. but we were also invited by several commission in the Swiss Parliament, so we could go there and present the study and discuss with the parliamentarians. And there were numerous political interpellations and requests at national, but also at the cantonal level. So it's really broadly discussed. Now we have some reports pending from the federal administration, and the Federal Office of the Environment is now, based on our study, trying to make proposing some reforms for several of the 162 subsidies we've identified. 10, I think. Okay, here you have a fact sheet of the study in English and French. I don't want to take them home, so please take some. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lena. They will get the fact sheet after, because if they get the fact sheet now, they are not going to listen to Aldo. So I'm letting the floor to Aldo. If he can also keep on 7 minutes, would be great. Thank you, Aldo.
Thank you, Guillaume. It's very interesting to be here in the IUCN Congress, where, by the way, a Swiss Director Minister for Environment is now leading IUCN. So we might have good news on the subsidies front. And it's very pleasant to be with the Conservation Finance Alliance in its pavilion at IUCN, because attention to subsidies is growing, and probably we have very good reasons for doing that. I am helping the Plan Bleu for Environment in Mediterranean, who has started to work also on subsidies recently. I teach at universities in Rome, and this is my official position here, to be freer to speak with colleagues and experts. But I happen to chair some of the OECD committees on environmental taxation and on biodiversity. I'm getting old. Next slide, please, but it's to me to do it, and it works. I come from Rome, just for information. And there are 10 things I would like to say. First, biodiversity subsidies reform. Where are we working in which framework, in which area? Are we just talking about biodiversity harmful subsidies? Harmful to nature, to natural capital, to ecosystem, whatever the approach that we have in our professional experience or in our research experience. We might talk about biodiversity harmful subsidies in the frame of fossil fuel subsidies, because most of fossil fuel subsidies, which are relevant for climate, are also relevant for biodiversity and nature, if you go to analyze in the detail. We might talk about biodiversity harmful subsidies in the general framework of environmentally harmful subsidies, which is what we approach until now, biodiversity harmful subsidies being a subset of all the family of environmental harmful subsidies. But there are questions here, we'll come to back a little bit later. Then we have to think if we are moving in a framework of environmental fiscal reform, environmental tax reform, or ecological green tax reform, whatever we call it in different arena and researches. Green tax reform, you remember, is shifting the tax burden from labor and firms to pollution and to the use of natural resources. This is the main strong idea behind an environmental fiscal reform. But sometimes we might have the opportunity to introduce elements for the elimination of biodiversity harmful subsidies in a general tax reform framework. And this has happened in some countries and is quite interesting. There's no optimal solution. It depends on the political framework where the opportunities appear. Some countries have chosen to focus on one single measures. As you mentioned also, Lena, it's a possibility, one or two very symbolic, strong measures, which may give the example and open the way for that. And this has been, for example, in Indonesia with energy subsidies, in Germany, when we have this transfer from excise taxes on fuels to labor taxes, down labor taxes, up excise taxes, and say also with Sweden, with the carbon tax. But we have examples of good environmental fiscal reforms, mainly in European Nordic countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland. And we have good examples with general tax reform, like in Ireland and in Portugal, where we introduced a number of environmentally relevant fiscal elements, also cancelling a number of subsidies harmful to biodiversity. We'll see for my country what will happen as a general tax reform has has been announced by the new government, Draghi. Then we have to think if we work at national level, at subnational level, depending on our single countries, if they are states, départements, provinces, cantons, or different ways to call this, or at regional in the international meaning of the word level, so by continent or by APEC area or NAFTA or whatever. Or if we can, it would be the best, work all together at global level in international conventions. It's better to work together than to work alone in these aspects, because it's a question of market, of transparency, and so on. The larger, the better. Economies of scale, economies of scope, level playing field, common effort. We know these elements. Un faux ami, as our French friends call it, is pay attention that obviously through subsidies, we are helping sometimes the poor or industrial and agricultural sector, which we think politically, socially, that they deserve support, they deserve solidarity. And certainly some sectors, some citizens, some consumers need supports, deserve supports, but it's not by underpricing the environment that we will achieve this objective at the best. This doesn't work if we underprice the environment, if you allow me this expression. Solidarity is fundamental, but redistribution issues might probably be treated as general affordability to life, to consumption, to quality of life, and not with specific energy poverty problem, food poverty problem, water poverty problem. I know it's a delicate issue, but I propose and I suggest to our reflection to go for general poverty problems and not by specific sector. We have alternative instruments to help the poor, those in need, those who are vulnerable, and OECD, for example, has shown us the way in this kind of things. We need to offer sometimes something in exchange in the best meaning of this word, in political meaning of the word. We need compensation. We want to eliminate market distortions when we cancel biodiversity harmful subsidies or we go for an ecological tax reform. So we are restoring market conditions, market transparency, market fairness. We're not distorting the market as we are accused very often to do. We try to apply the polluter pays principle to internalize externalities, to promote sustainable development. So the point here politically is that when we propose these kinds of measures, reducing, reforming, abolishing biodiversity harmful subsidies, is to offer something in exchange which is more transparent. And we should avoid to announce that the day after, as we had done, for example, in France, when the fossil fuel taxes have been announced in increase, the compensation measures were ready and effective. I've been talking with the experts of the Ministry of Ecology of France. They were ready, but they have been announced the day after. It was too late. On all the newspapers, you had, oh my God, the fuel tax is increasing again. That's a major problem. And it was not well announced. And we had the same problem in Italy, for example, with the plastic tax. My third point, and I will be now extremely brief, is the importance of national catalog inventories, trying to understand the situation at national level. We had the France report, the Centenary report, as we call it. It's called biodiversity harmful subsidies, and it is a biodiversity harmful subsidies, but the definition, interpretation of biodiversity means that at the end of the day, you have almost all environmentally harmful subsidies inside. We must be comprehensive. In Germany, we had good work by the Environment Agency, and then specific on biodiversity by the Nature Agency, which is separate in Germany from the Environment Agency. We had Sweden, Finland. We heard Switzerland, very interesting recent work, and we did it in Italy 3 times already in 2017, 18, 19. It's not environmentally harmful subsidies only, it's also environmentally friendly subsidies. Katia Karuzakis was reminding us that we have to cope with 2 aspects of the story. Now France is working on what they call the greening state budget, and we have also at the G20 and APEC level these fossil fuel subsidies peer reviews, which may help. This is our catalog. Quoting Don Giovanni by Mozart, we have found more than 200 subsidies, which is quite amazing. And the more we go, the more we find new subsidies which need to be analyzed. There's a lot of good work for those experts and colleagues who wish to work on these elements. You might know the OECD work. We heard a lot of things on biodiversity, on scaling up biodiversity finance, on fossil fuel subsidies and on fishery subsidies, on agriculture subsidies, and the database, which was quoted by Katia, the PINE database. But at UNEP, there is a lot of good work, at IMF, at IRENA on energy subsidies report. UNDP Biofin catalog is well known by the community of biodiversity experts, taking a list of 140 measures available to be used for biodiversity. We have at World Bank the Carbon Pricing Leaders Coalition and many other things. And a number of think tanks are working on these things very usefully also. The IISD with the Global Subsidies Initiative, GSI, the IEP, which has at this very moment a research for the European Commission on environmental fiscal reform, and VVA, another think tank, which has another research on environmentally harmful subsidies for the European Commission. We are looking forward. They are imminent. They should come out quite soon, and maybe the speaker from the Commission later will tell us something about it. World Resources Institute in Washington, Green Budget Europe, European Environment Bureau. We have a number of colleagues who are working on that. Katia mentioned also the usefulness of G20 peer reviews on fossil fuel subsidies, which have been followed by OECD. You have a list of countries which have been through already. And we might think if we should propose similar peer reviews specifically on biodiversity harmful subsidies. We need to cooperate all together, experts of a different community. So not only biodiversity and environment experts, certainly, but not only people from industry, business, or from energy. We need the people from fiscal, taxation, administration, and finance. We must pay attention on what is going on. We have a misinterpretation of fossil fuel subsidies going on in the G20 and G7 community. They're always described as inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Sincerely, I don't know what are inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. All fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient from an economic and an ecological point of view, maybe socially, but as we said, we have alternative measures. So let's pay attention. Inefficient is a descriptive term. If you go to the original commitment of the G20, it comes out quite clear. There is work in the SDG world, the indicator on fossil fuel subsidies. We might think to propose something specific on biodiversity. Obviously, we have to use the linkages and the networking with the biodiversity scientists in BPBS, obviously, but also in IPCC, in IRP, the International Resources Panel, and here at IUCN. Can CFA also play a role in this? I think they can. We can use our common work in international human community, SDGs, FCCC, CBD. With robust biodiversity ecosystem services, we strengthen the economic system. We are not distorting it. We make it more robust and sustainable in the long term. And we'll see what will come out from the G7 and G20 this year with UK and Italian presidency. Probably a quite limited approach and contribution, but this is another area where we should work. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Aldo. Thank you very much. It's a bit a sprint, but I'm going to follow the sprint. If I can have the PowerPoint, and I will go on with France. Aldo, thank you, Aldo. Aldo mentioned the French work, which was made in 2010 and 2011 already, and which was one of the first to be done. We are going to have the slide very soon, I guess. I was asked to chair an official commission, which was near in this center, which is a public analysis center near the Prime Minister office, on the specific subject of public incentives harmful to biodiversity. So the subject was really biodiversity, because we have already a lot of work on subsidies to fossil fuels, which is rather well known now, but public incentives harmful to biodiversity was not so much well known. So I guess it's, which one is it? It's sur le droite? No. Comme ça. Okay, so this was the process. I'm not going to be too long on that. This is also the process. You can see it. I'm not going to comment every slide. This is a request by the government. It was at the time of the Grenelle de l'environnement, as some of you can remember. And again, this was already shown notably by Lena and Aldo. So we have some international text and strategy asking for this reform. This is important because it's one of the negotiations we have now for the next biodiversity COP, and there is a lot of work on the new version of this IKI target, which is the A3 IKI target, and we will have this target in the version which is now existing. We will have this target again. And in France, as I was saying, the Loi Grenelle, which was a big law on environment, was explicitly asking this process. So we have made the methodology was to start from the 5 great causes of biodiversity loss and to examine the subsidies existing in this field. The first problem was to find a definition of public incentives, because we have no international public incentives making consensus. So there is several ones. And finally, the working group, to my surprise, accepted the largest definition. Why, to my surprise? Because inside the working group, we had stakeholders like farmers, like industrial, etc., and they had no interest to accept the definition. But for us, it was a good thing because it could be more a global thing, I would say. So I'm going to take some example, very few examples, because we have no time, of public incentive. We have find and we have examine. Sorry, I've been too, okay. There was a, here it is. Voilà. For example, you have a tax credit on when you plant some woods, and it could be a good thing. It depends on the place where you plant the woods. If you plant the woods on the polluted soil or on the agricultural soil, it's okay. But if you plant the wood on wetlands or on old meadow, you are going to diminish the biodiversity. And this specific problem is not taken into account in this tax spending. You have this, which is very well known. It's one thing on the energy. And the internalization failure means that one of the problems we have in France is that the level of the tax, the rate of the tax, is very much under the external cost, which is different, for example, from the policy of Sweden or Norway, where they have very high level of tax on pollutants. That means that the tax is about the same level as the cost of externality. And in France, we don't have at all this the same policy. Some other example, for example, the VAT registered rate on fertilizer and pesticides. The fact that you have a tax normally on when you build a new house, etc., but you have specific abatement where it's warehouse and hangar, which is strange because they are much they sprawl much more on the soil, so they waste much more natural spaces. You have several tax spending on agriculture. I'm not going to go into the detail. This is an interesting example. You have on the parking area, the tax is much lower when you have an air parking area, and it's much higher when you have a parking which is under a house, when you build a house, which is should be the contrary if you want to save some space, you know. And then the difference is really big. And of course, it's cost much more money to build parking under a house than to build a parking outside in the air. So it should be the contrary to try to minimize the difference. The Eurovignette directive, it's a well-known example, and it's the same thing in every country, because we have some externality which is not legally possible to internalize this cost in the Eurovignette directive, and so in the law of the state member. So I take here more deeply into this example, which is what we call a tax d'aménagement. You can see some tax credit existing. And of course, these tax credits existing are not good for biodiversity. So we have made some proposition for everything. We have made some proposition in the report, and we have proposed to either suppress, either reduce this the difference of tax. It's huge. So it's clearly something. It's not completely non-normal, because at the time this preoccupation was not been taken into account. But now we think this could change. Well, to finish, sea and littorals, because we are in Marseille, so we have to speak about sea and littoral. You can see that, for example, one problem which is raising very much is that the offshore wind electricity today, they only work with public subsidies. So sometimes they are put in a marine park area. So from one side, the state spend money to protect biodiversity and nature, and in the same space, he spend money to destroy a bit of the protection he has spent money to build, which is not only a problem for biodiversity, but also a problem for the logic of public spending if you want to make some saving. And it's more useful than ever to make saving after the COVID crisis, of course. So I think I will finish with that. No, sorry, I have still this slide on the freshwater. You can see that we have a good law on water in France since a long time, but we have still some subsidies or tax credit or tax spending, which are not incitating to save water. And wetlands, yes, sorry, I finished by wetland because it's, of course, very important wetlands. We have, again, some and I'm going to enter into detail because we have no more time for that. I will stop there, and I will, if Helen can hear us, I will give the floor to Helen, which is going to have a very important presentation, because she is going to tell us how European Union, how European Commission is thinking about this, how what the projects are, and I'm sure that she will be able to give a solution to all this problem and to explain us how we are going to be able to solve this problem of harmful subsidies to biodiversity. Helen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Guillaume. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. I hope you can hear me and you can see my slides. Okay, that's great. Very sorry for not being present physically with you in Marseille today. But indeed, I'd like to give you a few insights on the work that is going on at EU level in relation to biodiversity harmful subsidies. So, well, I understand the time is limited, and so I won't go into describing earlier work by the European Commission on harmful subsidies, including our earlier biodiversity proofing framework. But more recently, we have been working in the context of the European Green Deal adopted at the end of 2019. And as you may know, one of the key elements in that, one of the key principles affirmed in the European Green Deal is the do no harm principle. And so this has been very much guiding our work over the last 2 years. There is also a significant emphasis on green budgeting tools, with quite some work that has happened within the European Commission and EU member states since the adoption of the Green Deal. The EU biodiversity strategy was also adopted last year, and among other things, it sets that the EU will strengthen its biodiversity proofing framework. It also reaffirms the EU zero tolerance towards illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, and in terms of combating overfishing, including through WTO negotiations, but then there are many other measures across various policy areas, including in the field of agriculture and forestry, just to name those ones. So in practice, what have we been doing to tackle harmful subsidies and to operationalize the do no harm principle at EU level? So that relates especially to the EU long-term budget, the multi-annual financial framework for the period 2021-2027, but also Next Generation EU, which is the EU recovery plan. And so here, just to give you a few examples, we've been working on Commission checklist to help EU member states develop their recovery and resilience plans in the context of the post-COVID recovery. And so now EU member states have to check all investments under their recovery plan against this Commission checklist, which helps seeing how to operationalize the do no significant harm principle. Another example is the InvestEU program. So that's the new EU investment program where we have developed sustainability proofing guidelines, which again include biodiversity and enable to make sure that investments are environmentally proof. Now, of course, there is the work happening in the various EU funding programs, and I'll come to that in a minute. In addition, the Commission is, and I think our Italian colleague mentioned it, we are just finishing a study which aims at providing stakeholders and EU member states with a toolbox to identify environmentally harmful subsidies, including biodiversity harmful subsidies, and then identify the various impacts of their phasing out. And there is also quite a lot of work happening here. I'm not going into the details, but there would be a lot to say here too. So now maybe just a quick focus on the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility and EU member states recovery and resilience plans, where I mentioned this checklist in relation to do no significant harm. And so, as you can imagine here, EU law, especially the nature directives, are playing a central role. But we go beyond legislation. We look at EU policies and targets, the EU sustainable finance taxonomy principles, in order to make sure that investments are sustainably proof. So that's it in relation to recovery. Then, as you can imagine, one of the big question marks relates to the common agriculture policy in the EU, where negotiations concluded quite recently on the future CAP, which will start being implemented as of 2023. And here, as you may know, there is an ambition to have CAP strategic plans playing a central role to try and have greater contribution to biodiversity. We will have 9 specific objectives in the CAP, including one specifically for biodiversity. And so in their CAP strategic plans, member states, we have to set explicitly national values as set in the EU biodiversity strategy. So there is an effort here to indeed improve the way things have been working, but of course now all depend on the way EU member states implement that. Now, there is also, quite some work happening in the context of the EU Common Fisheries Policy, which went under significant reforms to phase out harmful subsidies and shift in favor of subsidies that would promote sustainable fishing. So here again, we have a new European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund with specific attention to overfishing and overcapacity. And in that context, the EU is also actively engaged in the WTO negotiations on fishery subsidies. And here, I think our hope is that we will manage to reach an ambitious deal as we prepare for the next ministerial conference in November. And so we are carefully looking at the negotiation text in view of that meeting. We are also stepping up our work on green budgeting. As I indicated earlier, it was a commitment under the European Green Deal. Since the end of 2019, the European Commission has been actively engaging with EU member states to promote green budgeting practices. We have developed various tools to help EU member states, especially a green budgeting reference framework. And now we're having regular discussions with member states and surveys to help them implementing these green budgeting principles. Now, maybe a last word, and I think Katia and others mentioned it. As you know, there is a link to ongoing negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity and preparations for the COP in Kunming. Especially next year, we're working on the basis of the first draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, where we are working on the basis of a draft target on harmful incentives, including harmful subsidies, as well as positive incentives, which is another important part of the discussion. So we are just out of 2 weeks of meetings in the context of the CBD to try and make progress on that. So that was a bit of a quick overview of where we stand right now on biodiversity harmful subsidies, but again, happy to discuss and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hélène. So I open the question and answer session now. We have still some minutes to, if somebody wants to ask question or see some, because we have been very quick. So if some point have not been well understood, we are happy to, both of us, to answer any question. So, Ina, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Lina Toad. I'm Deputy Director of Plan Bleu, which is the Regional Activity Center of UNEP's Mediterranean Action Plan. So we are working on the environment in the Mediterranean region specifically, and throughout the last 6 months with my colleague Melina, who is here, we have been working on an exploratory study on environmentally harmful subsidies in the Mediterranean region. Exploratory because we wanted just to have an overview of what already exists in the Mediterranean and where we could do some further work, which we are planning for the next 2 years to come. So we are currently in the scoping phase of this work. And my question really is to the audience much more than to the speakers. If there is somebody in the audience who is working on a Mediterranean country on the subject of environmentally harmful subsidies, I would be very happy to link up with you and get in touch with you. I am already in touch, or Plan Bleu more broadly is already in touch with most of the speakers, not with Hélène Perrier, I think, and it would make sense, I think, to have a moment and talk together about what we could do together, because the European Union is also a contracting party to the Barcelona Convention. So for us, it would be quite naturally to reach out to you and see what we can do together. But yeah, this is really an invitation to the audience to try to work together on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. Is there anybody from a Mediterranean country here able to give help to Lina or to answer her? No? No? If no, Mr. there.
Thank you.
Speak loud, speak loud.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentations. Can you hear me? Okay. So my question goes to Helene and also to the research from the, you come from the Research Institute? Sorry, Lina? Yes. I'm from Ghana in West Africa. I know the EU's Green Deal is looking at several opportunities also for African countries. And this discussion looking at subsidies and also the incentives and all of that, I see a lot of it is concentrated in Europe. But Europe is also engaged in several business and trade with African countries. How are we using these incentives and subsidies to promote good business in Africa that is also sustaining biodiversity? And to add into this also, we know that there are several investments by European countries that are also somehow driving deforestation and also leading to several extractive industries. I want to know how you are using your system of subsidies and incentives to really tackle this very crucial aspect of trade, which has negative impact on biodiversity. I know we are doing the VPA in Ghana, but I think we can still do more. And I want to see how the EU Green Deal is going to facilitate that. And then to Lina, I want to ask, you've done a lot of research. How do you make this research available to us also in Africa? Because there's quite a lot of subsidies in our countries as well that are harmful to biodiversity and conservation. but this is not prioritized. And I think that discussion needs to be highlighted very strongly. And I'm sure this platform and the expertise here could somehow initiate some of these discussions within the African countries. Thank you.
You want to?
Well, I can try. In our study, we really looked only at Swiss subsidies, and we didn't looked at the effect outside Switzerland, even though they would be. I know some studies which analyzed the external costs, or which analyzed in detail the external costs from all the imports and all the money spent like this more in ecological footprints and quantify it, but we didn't look outside Switzerland. You asked me how we can make it available. We are now working on a web application where you can kind of find the subsidies easier. You can click on them, you have all the information. It makes it more easier than a big Excel sheet. But as we only talk, we make it for Swiss politicians and Swiss people. As we talk only for Switzerland, it's in German. It would be in German for first time. We have this English fact sheet that it's all we have for the international audience.
Yes, because your question is very important, so I would like to ask 2 or 3 points. First of all, Ghana is one of the countries having done some efforts in this domain, in this field. OECD is quoting Ghana as trying to do good reforms, notably in the subsidy for energy and for fossil fuels energy. So that's a good thing. The second thing that we have to keep in mind is that in the developing countries, subsidies are not a good thing for the poor, because subsidies to harmful to for environment or going to energy are not going to the poorest. They are going to the middle class, because in this type of country, the poor have no even car and they don't take the plane. And so all these subsidies to energy are not helping to resolve the problem of the poor in this country. But I'm sure that you can find some methodological help in the OECD publication. A lot of they are all in English, some are in French, etc. And Aldo has got a lot of think tank working on that, specifically on fossil fuel. There is more and more on that, but on forest also, on fishing, etc. And Aldo, want to add something?
Just that some of these country reports have tried to estimate international subsidies. It's not easy. I'm thinking to export credit help, support and insurance. There is methodological problems on how we translate and make it comparable to flows, which are mainly from the public, state, government, public finance. But there is an attention growing on these things. And certainly these reports, they are official by governments, but they are born from small groups of researchers and experts. So certainly it would be very helpful if other countries could join the exercise. I don't know if Ghana is available and other countries, because it would show the way we all have in common these problems.
Just to add one very little point, to remember that UNEP, which is based in Africa, by the way, and UNDP are also promoting this type of reform, and UNDP is doing it because they think it's also a good reform in social and economic point of view, and IMF also, and World Bank also, etc. So it's not only a question of environment. And I know that UNDP was trying to look after 2 countries, one English-speaking country in Africa and another one French-speaking country in Africa, to do this type of national studies to be example for other African countries to do it. So maybe Ghana, which is in advance, if we compare with other countries, could be one of these 2 countries. I think we have to close now. Thank you very much for having been there. Sorry, we have all been obliged to speak very fast, but it was the timing. And we have the Lena report, which is there. You can take it with you.